Geography and You presents.
Welcome to a special episode of GNY Live, where we explore the powerful intersections between science and diplomacy. I'm your host, Hiteshika, and today's conversation steps beyond our usual series to delve into an emerging field shaping the future of global cooperation, science diplomacy. In a world grappling with climate change, pandemics, and digital revolutions, the need for informed, evidence based negotiations have never been greater. How does science shape diplomatic strategy? Can scientists become effective diplomats? And what does it mean for foreign policy when scientific collaborations define economic and political alignments? To help us navigate these questions, we are honored to be joined by Ambassador Pankaj Saran, convener of the NatStrat and President at Lights, and a distinguished former Deputy National Security Advisor of India, an accomplished career diplomat with extensive experience across Russia, Bangladesh, and multilateral forums. His insights from decades of foreign policy work offer a rare vantage point into how knowledge, negotiation, and national interest converge. Joining us in this important dialogue is our discussant, Dr. Shulagna Chattopadhyay, Editor in Chief of Geography and You, an expert in climate communication and policy with over 3 decades of experience in environmental governance. With that, over to you, Dr. Chattopadhyay.
Thank you, Hiteshika, and it is an honor to welcome you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Salakna. It's a great pleasure to be on your show. Congratulations.
Thank you. So let us begin at the beginning, the history of where all of this began, where science converged with diplomacy, really. So, are there any experiences that you have where you have met or seen or heard of people who bridged this gap, like took science beyond science into negotiation?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. I mean, we have a lot of illustrious Indian scientists and foreign scientists who, after being and doing pure science, they reached the level of policy making. And then they became administrators of science. And the next step, of course, was then they became the ambassadors of science for the country. So in different fields, whether you take, and I'm talking about Indians, like in the nuclear, in space, in agriculture, in food security, in climate, in all of these, and pure science, of course, you've had very famous names. I mean, for example, you've had Homai Bhabha, you had Mr. Setna, you've had M.S. Swaminathan, you've had Mr. Mashelkar, who still works in Pune. He's got so much of contribution. R. Chidambaram. Recently, Mr. Jan Narlikar has passed away. He was in astrophysics. So there is a whole galaxy of such people. Now, it doesn't work the other way, where a diplomat becomes a scientist. It's typically the traffic is one way, and that tells us that you have to have the basic core domain knowledge of your subject before you can then become. So there is this constant, dialogue and constant debate. Let's say even when you are heading scientific organizations or international scientific organizations, such as, say, for example, the WHO, the World Health Organization, or there are so many, like in the field of agriculture, in the field of what else can I say? I can give you more examples. So the question is whether they should be headed by people who are good administrators or whether they should be headed by scientists. I mean, that's the real debate. And it goes on. Yeah. But to answer briefly your question, and there are, of course, international examples of scientists who then went on to become international civil servants and ambassadors for their profession. I mean, in India, there are a few examples who became members of parliament. And we talked about it before the show. So, yes, there is a very historical linkage, I would say.
Yeah, to take this forward, Ambassador, I would like to know from you that how many such forums have you attended, because you've been a career diplomat. So, how many forums have you attended where you find that science is one of the prominent needs of that forum? And on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is science diplomacy really in the modern world with the climate change and all of that?
Yeah, I can't readily remember how many I attended, but I'm just trying to think of some of the more interesting ones which I might have been a part of. Let me start with one example, which was the nuclear issue, and on that I found that it is absolutely important to have the nuclear scientists play an important role. So the way it would work is that you would ask the basic questions from the nuclear scientists and understand the issue, the science of it, and then sit down in a group of countries or with another country, and they would do the same thing and then try and negotiate. Now the question is, what would be the objective of that negotiation? Like, say, for example, if you want to negotiate an international treaty or an international convention or a protocol, you have to ask yourself, as India, what are my objectives? What policy space do I want to preserve? Is the international binding nature of the outcome so tight or so detrimental to me that it may effectively halt my own scientific progress? Then I will seek to protect myself and not allow any international agreement to be reached which prevents me from achieving my own scientific research development potential. So I would try to, for example, when the nuclear non-proliferation treaty was negotiated, India was not a nuclear weapon state. And that treaty is a classic example of a discriminatory treaty that some of the nuclear weapon states decided at one point in time that we will have a treaty, and anyone who's become a nuclear power before that date will be recognized internationally as a nuclear weapon state. But anyone who, after that date, does anything would be found to be in contravention of the treaty. So, in a sense, you created a world of haves with the nuclear technology and the rest which were have-nots. And you made this line on the sand in perpetuity. The same thing happened whether you talk about fissile material or you talk about outer space. So the race to the outer space. And so therefore here your space scientists come in. So the policymaker will ask, how soon can I launch the satellites or the launch vehicles to actually explore space? Because if there is an international agreement that from this date onwards there shall be no space exploration, or there is a treaty which says you will not allow to create any space debris, or that you limit the number of satellites, theoretically speaking, or the same thing could apply for deep sea exploration. That, I mean, you've had international treaties being negotiated for years and years on, the UNCLOS, the fishing, deep sea mining. So all of these require science. Now, climate is something which everyone is familiar with, but we'll come to it. But I just want to also leave the thought with you that as we speak today, the most challenging issue today where we find convergence between science and policy is artificial intelligence. Because as we are speaking, there is a very active process going on to decide how the world will govern artificial intelligence, the science of it. So the global governance of AI is today the most challenging, and it is the most current where our researchers, our scientists, and our policymakers are all having to sit across the table and decide what is in India's interest. So, firstly, what is in the world's interest? What is in the interest of the science itself? So, you adopt a purist attitude, but then you also have to be real that what is in finally India's interest.
So this is like, it's quite a proposition actually. You have kind of said that climate, AI is going to leave kind of climate behind because AI will be more disruptive than anything else that we have known till today. So because of how disruptive AI can be, negotiation becomes all the more a priority in that domain of science actually. So no, you don't.
No, you're right. Of course, 100%. But also remember that, and this is something our scientists know, not ours, but any scientist will know. I mean, the Oppenheimer moment, right?
Yeah.
You have the science. The question is, how do you apply it? You have AI. You know what it can do.
Yeah.
It can transform your life, and it will transform. There is no doubt. We're entering the AI age. But like any other previous sciences, whether it was nuclear or space or biotechnology or any other thing, once the science exists, it has dual use applications. You can use it for good, you can use it for evil. And that is the real challenge. How do you make everyone use that science only for good and not for evil? That is the real issue.
So I will pick a thought from there and I will ask you, how does diplomacy distinguish between commercial applications of science and like the other, like for example, you said space, you talked about nuclear, for people good, and of course climate sciences, where we do the research to find out about the impact, the entire impact on the entire global systems, not on a particular nation or a particular. So it kind of transcends boundaries really. So AI will also transcend boundaries. So none of this would be respecting the boundary
Absolutely,
really.
yeah.
So
Absolutely.
here, how would you distinguish between science that respects boundaries and science that does not really have any need for or requirement for boundary?
So you also raised this commercial science
Yes,
aspect.
yeah.
So, I mean, there are two different issues: the science within national boundaries and science internationally. Now, normally you would expect the two to complement each other. But sometimes what happens is that when the science is so critical to national interest, the typical tendency of countries would be to protect their scientific achievements and not share with others.
Huh.
Or they will share only partially
Hmm.
because they want to maintain the scientific edge over other countries.
Correct.
Because science is a factor of national power. So
Absolutely.
typically, history teaches us that countries which have possessed advanced science are also the ones which progress faster. And you can apply the science. So then science becomes technology, it becomes commercial application. Now, some of these international institutions and agencies were meant to allow merger of both your national objectives and international objectives. It's not always easy to merge the two. On the commercial aspect of what you asked about science, here, I mean, like we were discussing, if there is a country which possesses rare earths or which possesses the technology for processing of the rare earths or critical materials or critical minerals, it's a commercial proposition, but it is also a national security or a political proposition that you want to maintain monopoly, because if you have monopoly, you make more profit and you create dependency on you, so you leverage it for strategic advantage. So I would say commercial science or the commercial application of science involves diplomacy of a different kind. It's unfortunately sometimes not ethical. It is, very realpolitik where you are purely doing things out of your own national interest. And then the profit motive, but also the strategic motive. So it's not just making money out of the science that you have. but it's also maintaining the edge and creating dependencies on you by others. So you want to make yourself indispensable or acquire, a leadership over everyone else. So if you take, for example, the leading scientific nations of the world, that is what they have done, and people respect those nations which do original science.
Yeah.
I mean, like in the COVID times, India showed that its vaccine development program was probably the best in terms of quality and scale. Scale is also important.
Yes.
And the cost. So that didn't happen overnight, right? You had a vaccine program which was going on for years. You had mastered it. A lot of science went into it. So, I mean, even agriculture, for example, our founding fathers, they understood the importance of agricultural science because you wanted to feed your people. And, in this business, no one actually gives you science for free. Sometimes you have to invent and develop it yourself. So many agriculture science institutions were created for seeds, for fertilizer, for climate, for weather forecasting, and all of these. So it's interesting. It's very interesting. When more you discuss it, the more you realize.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's so many things that you're opening up in my head right now. So now this leads me to two places. The first, which will come a little bit later, about you said that things are not really studied in diplomacy terms very well in this domain, which will come a little later. But before that, since you've been in Russia, I'm very tempted to open up a little discussion on
Sure,
Russia. So basically, what my question is that despite conflicts in certain areas in the world, whether it's, Russia-Ukraine conflict and the NATO countries, there are still certain agreements that are based on science that continue to function.
Yes.
So there are certain fishing agreements, for example, fishing catch, and these are very critical seas. I mean, they have very cold waters, so they have to have a particular life cycle. They cannot catch beyond a certain limit, and that is respected by both the countries. So in such contexts, science trumps I'm sorry, that was
He'll be happy. He'll be happy
so
to hear you use his name.
yeah, but the two of them don't come together.
Yeah.
But what, in your view, is the need of science, or the peacekeeping role of science, really?
Oh, it's very important. There was this whole program called Atoms for Peace. What was that all about? It was about using atomic energy and nuclear fission and nuclear fusion for peaceful purposes. But finally, what has happened?
Yeah.
So we know that you start with a good intent, but once the genie is out of the bottle, you can't control its application. But on this point which you made, which is very important, whether science can become a tool at a stage when there is geopolitical tension or conflict between nations, absolutely. It can be a great bridge and because it is non-controversial to a certain level. You can collaborate in science and in natural sciences, physical sciences. It's not political. And when scientists meet, like writers or thinkers, you have a good, healthy dialogue. Or musicians,
Yeah.
You have a common language, right? And you have that common passion for formulas and research and all. So it's great. But I would you would know better than anyone else, the role science has played in the two poles. I mean, the International Geophysical Year,
Yeah.
1957-58, that led to the establishment or the negotiation of the Antarctic Treaty and the whole system, the treaty system. And it is so amazing that you had this treaty, the Antarctic Treaty, at the height of the Cold War.
Absolutely.
And it has survived. It has survived despite the Cold War. And even today, despite all the political problems, scientific research, one of our own research people in our stations was telling me the other day till I think even last year or the year before, while the Ukraine war was going on, he said we have a research station, we had a ship going there, and so it was we leased the ship, I think from the Russians, and we had Ukrainian scientists on the ship.
Yeah.
So this is a best example of science and scientists working together. So the Antarctic is a great example where you have still science has still played and is playing that role, and it's not completely scattered or broken down the system. Fishing, of course, you mentioned. So there are other examples. Unfortunately, the Arctic is a bad example because there it's really affected the science. But in the Arctic case, what has happened is that you started with the science, but as you know, the last few years, particularly as ice warming has started and all, the geopolitics of it and the security part and the military part is now being talked about more openly than in the past. But in the Antarctic case also, I mean, there were some fundamental principles of the treaty, and one of those, there was no military presence. It would only be for science. You'd protect the environment. So, I mean, I would say that these are some examples of how, to prove your point, science
Can be peacekeepers.
can be peacekeepers, exactly.
Okay. So now tell us about the institutional part of putting science diplomacy really at the center stage, because you have fairly through your this discussion we have fairly established that science indeed is one of the most prominent or central to a lot of things. So if science is central to myriad requirements in diplomacy, then can we center stage it in institutional frameworks
Yes,
also?
we can.
And why is it not happening?
No, it is happening. I mean, when I was ambassador in Moscow, we had a post of a counselor for science and technology. And his only job was to liaise with Russian scientists and the Russian Academy of Sciences and the entire scientific community across Russia. Similarly, you have science counselors or attaches in many Indian embassies abroad who are taken from the scientific departments and positioned there, and they are supposed to actually be fusing their scientific knowledge with diplomatic act. So we have institutional arrangements. Similarly, for example, in the Department of Science and Technology, there is a whole international cooperation wing whose only job is to negotiate scientific agreements with foreign countries. And I think, I don't remember the number, but we should probably have close to maybe 100 such agreements with different countries on different aspects of science. So there is institutional arrangements in the government and outside of government also, semi-government or autonomous scientific institutions have linkages. So it is happening and it is there. Question is whether we can do more.
And about academia, in the sense, like, do we have in IR a strong sense of science diplomacy?
In fact, in the Indian Foreign Service, we have a few retired ambassadors who've done a lot of work on science diplomacy. In fact, there's even a book written on it, I think by Mr. Balakrishnan, on science and diplomacy or science diplomacy. And maybe you can have a look at it. So there is a lot of work being done on this question.
So I would like to know from you, Ambassador, that giving this kind of a fractured world that we are now seeing, do you think that there should be a kind of a disassociation or a kind of a distance from science and geopolitics? Is it important or imperative to keep them apart for a bit, so that we don't have funding withdrawals, we don't have long-term sciences, it takes a very long time to put it all together, have 30-year, 50-year data, and then just to put a halt to that would mean that you lose everything. So what do you feel? Do you think there is like too much geopolitics now about science, or what is it that's like doing this, that the fundings are
getting? No, it's a good point. See, the fact is, today, what is the reality? The reality is that geopolitics or more specifically, geopolitical tensions and confrontation and competition is taking a big toll on everyone's life. Whether it is trade, whether it is economics, whether it is tourism, whether it is. So, in all walks of life, you're having the spillover of geopolitical tensions on even financial payment systems, everything. So, science, unfortunately, has also become a victim of geopolitical tensions. Now, is it a good thing or a bad thing? It's a terrible thing. We should at least insulate science. I mean, something has to be left untouched by interstate rivalry. And science is the best candidate to leave it insulated from wars, from conflicts, from geopolitical tensions. But is that happening? Unfortunately, no. Because we live in a real world and there is a spillover. And when things go beyond control, when it comes to the confrontation, it has a spillover. So, in the Arctic Council is a prime example that the Ukraine war has led almost to split down the middle. Not even the middle, actually, it's one versus the rest. And so, effectively, the work of the Arctic Council has shut down.
Yes.
So, what are the Russians doing now? They are trying to create their own parallel structure. So, it's not a good thing for those who are scientists. And if you ask even our scientists, they're not happy about it because of what you're saying. You know, there's data, there's publications, there is research papers. You know, people are saying, look, don't get us involved. It's like a cultural artist saying, look, or a sportsman, you know, keep the politics separate. But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way all the time. So, so this is, in fact, the reality. Now, there's some, like you had mentioned earlier, covenants, agreements, and treaties, which still remain, and people adhere to them. But there are other aspects which are taking a toll.
Yeah, so basically, what I see at least is like, please correct me if I'm incorrect, that bipartite agreements between, like, anything that is between two countries are honored better than a multi-country kind of an agreement. Is that correct? Or in your assessment, what do you see? Do you see that?
No, sometimes, yes, bilateral, I mean, between two countries, if you have agreements. I mean, let us say, for example, we had some agreements with, say, China, or with Pakistan, for example, how many of the science-related agreements are still? I would say they also have been affected, to be honest. Especially, we didn't have much with Pakistan, but we had with China. So yes, I mean, even let's say on things like hydrological data or sharing of waters,
Yes.
the number one casualty of tensions. So, but there could be others where, if you have, let's say, pure sciences, mathematics, physics, chemistry, pure research, maybe. But yes, but there are other examples. Let's say, for example, I told you rare earths or semiconductors or chips. It's very political. So, it depends on the area of the science. Now, in a few years ago, when our relations with China were better than they are today, we actually cooperated reasonably well in the climate change negotiations globally. We were working together, trying to protect our interests, trying to, establish common positions and promote our views. But that also became hostage to bilateral tensions. So this is the way it is. Now, there are international institutions going away from bilateral, multilaterally, which are pure science-based, like the World Meteorological Organization.
Yes.
Or let us say, as I told you, the WHO, or there are so many other we can think of. They remain. But the reality is that they're also very heavily politicized. I'm being a little more frank on this issue, because from the outside it doesn't appear that way. The mandates are nicely drafted.
WHO, or like World Health Organization, also
Yeah.
under a lot of flack in the
Yeah.
recent years, especially for African countries. So yes, I understand what you're saying, that
So what we have to do is to somehow protect the science and the scientists from these geopolitical tensions. That's important.
and I'll just, my last question to you now.
Sure.
Is about, so you have attended the ATCM, which is you have chaired it, in fact. So that is for the Antarctic consultative meeting, basically. And then you have also seen the series of COPs that we've had.
Yeah.
So, and it, like Antarctic Treaty is, like you just mentioned, is very specific, very different. And you have also been in all these other ones, which is like, it's almost like a festival of a lot of people, like diplomats and scientists and activists and all of that. So in your view, what is the future? What is it that we are looking at in terms of science diplomacy? In the future, would you imagine, because COP doesn't get us anywhere, really speaking, and ATCM has worked, and you said it. So if you have to do a comparison, it's not a comparison, but if you have to do one, then what would you
No,
feel?
look, the Antarctic Treaty, frankly speaking, is not a universal treaty.
Yeah.
It's not a United Nations treaty.
Yes.
It's a very cynical treaty, because it's a group of countries, self-selected, who decided to negotiate a treaty and then said it has become an international treaty.
Yes.
The rest of the 150 countries have nothing to do with it.
Exactly.
Whereas the Conference of Parties on the climate is a truly universal treaty organization, or a set of meetings, or a framework. So they're very different. One is universal, one is exclusive. It's not inclusive. Which model works better depends on the subject of the day. Now, in the UNFCCC framework, in the Conference of Parties, the COP framework, it's becoming more and more difficult to arrive at a consensus because of different positions. And you'll have so many fault lines, even among the developing countries. You'll have India taking one thing, China taking another, small island developing states taking another position, the least developed countries taking another position, and so on. So I mean, every COP meeting and summit is getting more and more difficult. For example, the biggest thing on the science was, this was a few years ago, the big debate at that time was whether we target for a 1% increase, 1 degree rise in temperature, or 1.5 degree rise in temperature, or a 2 degree rise in global temperature. Now, the scientists came out with their prognosis and their models, but all of this has real impact on the growth and development plans of individual countries. A 1.5 degree acceptance is totally different from 1 degree. So, how do you reconcile the science of rise in global temperature with your obligations to meet that target? And so the big fight in the COP process was about the kind of commitments which countries like India will take vis-a-vis the commitments which advanced countries will take. So we started talking about the whole issue of climate justice, of climate space, of paying for your past sins, of keeping opportunities open for your own growth. So it became so what happens is, in this, the scientists they take the front row, but after a few days they told you, okay, sit at the back. Your job is over. Now it's the diplomats and the politicians who come and do the hard negotiation. And when you finish, you realize that the science has been forgotten.
Okay, on that note, I mean,
It's not a very optimistic.
Not a very optimistic.
We're
one.
just trying to paint the real picture.
Yeah, but correct. I appreciate that. And thank you so much, Ambassador, for
Thank
being
you.
with us today. And we hope that we have more issues about opening up science and diplomacy connections. Thank you once again.
That brings us to the end of this insightful episode of GNY Live. We extend our heartfelt thanks to Ambassador Pankaj Saran for sharing his deep expertise and reflections on the evolving interplay between science and diplomacy. As we heard today, the role of science in diplomacy goes far beyond climate summits or global health emergencies. It's about how we, as nations, share data, build trust, create rules, and shape the global commons while navigating competing geopolitical interests. Stay tuned for more such conversations that bring together critical themes across science, society, and policy. Follow us on Spotify, YouTube, and Instagram so you never miss an episode. A detailed blog of this podcast will be soon uploaded on www.geographynu.com. Don't forget to check it out. Until next time, take care and stay curious.